It's the Real News Network. I'm Ben Norton. I'm continuing my discussion with Max Blumenthal, an and the editor of the Gray Zone Project, and also Jeb Sprague, who is an academic and specializes in globalization and the new kind of Cold War. In the first part of our discussion, we were talking about how Facebook is partnering with groups like the Atlantic Council, which are funded by the US government, and Facebook is purging alternative media outlets and different groups that challenge US state violence and US empire. In this part, we're going to continue the discussion talking about how the German Marshall Fund, which is a US government funded organization, has worked with the Atlantic Council, and its arm, the so-called Alliance for Securing Democracy, is pushing out a lot of these scare tactics, claiming that Russia and China are manipulating social media and therefore they must be purged. These accounts must be purged. Max, let's go to you for a second. In the first part of this interview, we talked about Jamie Fly. This is a neoconservative operative who works for the German Marshall Fund. He took credit in a discussion with Jeb Sprague, my other guest here. Jamie Fly took credit for the Facebook purge of alternative media outlets. Let's talk about other examples of censorship we've seen. In the first part of our interview, Jeb Sprague mentioned that websites like Haiti Analysis and Venezuela Analysis, which challenge US government narratives on Latin America, they actually saw their Facebook pages removed. In the case of Venezuela Analysis, this actually happened and it was brought back after widespread outrage, but it's also not limited to that. We saw Telesur, which is a pan-Latin American news outlet that's funded by numerous Latin American governments. Its Facebook page has been taken down 2 times and it has 500,000 likes. So talk about how Facebook is increasingly kind of testing the waters, suspending some of these pages, and also how Facebook is working with the Atlantic Council. Tell us what the Atlantic Council is and what you think the goals are.
A lot of questions there to unpack. I also came up with a headline for this: "Pretty fly for a neocon guy." I don't know. You can edit that part out or incorporate it into our discussion. But again, there's a lot to unpack. I'll do what I can. Basically, we're looking at a dark period for alternative media in the future. Those of us who have participated in online alternative media, I mean, I grew up, I came of age in journalism at the advent of online media when blogs were becoming popular, and aggregation sites were one of the main areas where people who wanted to be exposed to views and facts and reporting that existed outside the really narrowly constructed realm of corporate mainstream media could go to these pages. There was no Twitter at that time. There was no Facebook. Social media really broke the game open for alternative media, and we were able to disseminate our work to millions of people around the world in a way we had never done before. And if you read Yasha Levine's book Surveillance Valley, which is one of the most relevant works right now, you can understand how what we're seeing take place on Facebook and other platforms like it was inevitable. These are platforms that were born out of a surveillance architecture and were partly funded by ARPANET and other Pentagon-connected US government agencies to make surveilling average people easier. Facebook pages are used by the Israeli government to surveil Palestinians and to arrest or exclude Palestinians who are involved in political activity. They're also used by police in American inner cities to surveil those they consider gang members. And people have been arrested based on their Facebook activity in the US. So none of this is particularly surprising. What is surprising to me is how brazen a lot of the censorship is and how easy it was to predict based on based on a close look at Russiagate. I think the first real warning signal to me beyond Prop or Not that we were going to witness a massive purge of dissident media on Facebook and anywhere else that could take place was the Director of National Intelligence report in January 2017, which was supposed to prove that the Russians had meddled in our elections, but which wound up really disproportionately featuring enormous amounts of high school level media monitoring of RT's content, focusing particularly on two shows, one of which was Abby Martin's Breaking the Set, both of which were no longer on the air, and accused them of fomenting radical discontent. So this was a sign to me that the national security state was actually going to go after media that it considered radical. Whether it's on the right, where actually I don't think right-wing media truly threatens the national security state, or on the left, they were going to try to suppress the narrative. And that's been kind of taking place, as I said, in real time. Trial balloon, well, before I get to that, there has been, I felt some of it at the Gray Zone Project. I'll frequently get asked by Facebook to promote one of my posts, and then I'll be told that, the post has been rejected on political grounds, while I'm seeing all sorts of other sponsored content, including from far-right sites like CRTV. So there's no way for me to promote content on Facebook. Electronic Intifada has had the same problem, specifically around, my work, but on all kinds of stories. And there have been meetings between Facebook and the Israeli government on purging Palestinian content. This was taking place in 2017. Then this year, Facebook announced a partnership with the Atlantic Council, which is another group funded by NATO, as well as our good friends in Saudi Arabia and the arms industry, to basically oversee its election watch and ensure the integrity of election-related material. I am convinced that the Atlantic Council has had a role in this latest purge of alternative media. Facebook justified this most recent purge on the basis of cracking down on coordinated spamming and inauthentic activity. But sites like Anti-Media, I've confirmed this with them. There's just simply no evidence that they've engaged in spam. And in fact, Facebook offered them $500 in free advertising before they were purged. As far as I know, this site was verified by Facebook. The Free Thought Project was verified on Twitter before it was taken down. And there's this coordination between Twitter and Facebook, which really to me suggests a government role. So here's the last point I want to make, which is that these purges are being carried out by, under the watch of groups like the Atlantic Council and the German Marshall Fund. These are technically non-governmental organizations, but these groups are staffed entirely by former members of the national security state. Graham Brookie is the head of the Atlantic Council Initiative partnering with Facebook. He was in Obama's National Security Council. Basically, what the national security state has done is create these civil society fronts so they can have plausible deniability and say, we didn't do it, but their people are in there doing it, while Facebook executives and other Silicon Valley executives are getting dressed down by the Senate Intelligence Committee. So what we're witnessing in this country that supposedly has a First Amendment and believes in the free press is state-sponsored repression of media that produces inconvenient views. And I should mention too, that the Real News is a target. I know the Real News is a target because the Real News was targeted in the retracted and fully false piece by the journalistic fraud Andrew Reed Ross that somehow got into the Southern Poverty Law Center briefly. And then Real News was accused of being a 9/11 conspiracy site and not a legitimate progressive news site that's produced hundreds and hundreds of interviews with legitimate journalists and activists and even policymakers around the world. This was a really dangerous precedent. And I noticed that one of the researchers from the Alliance for Securing Democracy, this German Marshall Fund group, his name is Andrew Weisberg. He's a veteran online harasser, an anti-Palestinian activist who's been a researcher for this group, was actually supplying corrections to Andrew Reed Ross in the comments section on Southern Poverty Law Center, which suggested a wider operation. Now, I hope that the Real News leadership is aware of this, and I hope that everyone watching this who's in alternative media is aware that they could be next. And I'm certain that the reason the Real News was targeted was not for anything to do with 9/11, but because it has violated the ruthlessly enforced consensus on American empire, but particularly on Syria and Nicaragua and Venezuela, and has actually produced inconvenient facts that have made things uncomfortable for the forces that would like to push regime change in those countries. So it's time for everyone to be aware of what's happening and to band together and form an actual protest movement in support of a free media, because right now there's no countervailing force to this campaign of state-sponsored repression.
Oh, great comments, Max. We're almost out of time, Jeb, but I just really briefly want to go back to you. And can you just talk about the global geopolitics here in 2 or 3 minutes? You mentioned in the first part that Russiagate is actually now expanding to kind of Chinagate. Trump, without any evidence, accused China of meddling in the US election. So talk about how this, what we're seeing domestically, this censorship and this crackdown, is really part of a larger global campaign where the US is kind of reviving a new Cold War against not just Russia, but also China.
I think it's useful to think about like the change in the internet architecture and then also the geopolitical dynamic. Our entire lives, we've heard like this mantra of, you know, the internet is opening up freedom and democracy and people around the world communicating. Max and I are old enough to remember, you know, bulletin boards on CompuServe and Prodigy, and you know these old, you know, putting the phone on the modem to dial up. And our whole lives we've heard about this great liberating potential of the internet, but we see that really being clamped down on in a very much more public, very clear way. And we see this major change in the past. You know, when we were younger in the 80s, the 90s, they had to sell individual wars. They had to do these mass media blitzkriegs to convince people of these wars. But now we have like a generalized war, drone wars, constant wars all around the world that they don't have to sell individually. It's like they have to just sell this sort of general ideological framework of people to like be compliant and to you know, see what the state is doing as being legitimate. And so the internet then is like the real battleground of that for this fight for influence. And so I think it's interesting then to think about it in regards to global geopolitical economic dynamics. On one hand, China, the United States, Russia, big businesses, they're totally locked and integrated together. You know, Chinese oil companies going into Iraq, mining companies in Afghanistan, corporate interlocks have grown tremendously, cross-border mergers and acquisitions. But at the same time, there's still tension. So there's a lot of state enterprises and statist business groups in China and some other parts of the world that the U.S. and its allies would like to see broken up, because we've seen the extensive growth of capitalism, where every country across the world has, you know, has capitalism penetrating into its country. But now we're seeing the intensive, rather than the extensive, we're seeing the intensive expansion of capitalism deeper into the fabric of all these societies, where they need to target any public groups, you know, ways that capital can't get into it, like public enterprises or savings of people, that they want to privatize that and break into that. And so we see this tension now where transnational companies that are more closer with the United States and NATO and their allies want to break into these state oriented or partially state operated sectors in China and other parts of the world. And so I think for me, that's how I see this tension really playing out. And it's a completely contradictory situation. We have inequality unimaginable to our ancestors, mass climate change, and this globally integrated economy. But at the same time, there's real danger across the planet.
Well, we'll have to end it there. I was joined by Max Blumenthal, who's an award-winning journalist and the editor of the Gray Zone Project, and also Jeb Sprague, who is a visiting faculty member in sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we were discussing a report they co-authored at the Gray Zone Project on how Jamie Fly, a neoconservative operative in Washington, D.C., who works for a U.S. government think tank, has taken credit for the Facebook mass purge of alternative media and has pledged that this is only the beginning. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
For the Real News Network, I'm Ben Norton.